Dear colleagues, thank you very much for being with us today. This is Lina Papadopoulou and the Jean Monnet Chair of the Law School of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki on European Constitutional Law and Culture. Today we have, unfortunately, only on Zoom. It was not possible for them to fly on the right time. Two dear and very important colleagues, Professor Giuseppe Martinico and Professor Andrea Pin. We will start, as the program says, with Professor Andrea Pin. Andrea is an associate professor of comparative public law in Padua University. He has been a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, and previously he had also clerked for the Italian Constitutional Court judge Marta Cartabia. So today, Professor Andrea Pin will speak about the problems that we have been having in Europe concerning the rule of law. Thank you very much, Andrea, for being with us. And please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone, and apologize for not being able to be there in person. I take 15 minutes to present, more or less, and so I'm using the alarm because you cannot rely on Italians when it comes to keeping up with the pace. So I'm going to talk about some obvious aspects of common concern and other aspects that I hope. There's someone else with the microphone open, I think, Lina. Okay. Okay, thank you. So I was saying that something may not be that obvious. I'm hoping that may be of some interest. So the topic I chose is the problem with the rule of law in Europe and the role of courts. And I'm saying, so I'm arguing that the problem doesn't simply have to do with the so-called nationalist and populist turns that recently have mushroomed in Europe, but it also has to do with deeply seated rule of law culture and mechanisms that I think needs to be fixed to some extent, and more broadly with the constitutional culture that attaches to them. So, as I said, I'll start with the beginning. So I'll start with the very basic considerations. The several reports from the Venice Commission and the European Union institutions are very concerned about rule of law survival in Europe. And one of the main issues is the role of courts. So if you look at the list of issues that they group together when it comes to analyzing the factors that come into play for the survival of the rule of law, one of the key factors is courts. And of course, the role of courts has always been of paramount importance for the survival of the rule of law, at least since Dicey. I know that the idea of the rule of law stretches back to Aristotle, at least, and I'm not going to argue against this since I'm talking with someone from Aristotle University. But it's rather obvious that courts play an important role in that. But when it comes to Europe, courts have also an additional role that I will analyze briefly in a few minutes. However, when we consider the countermeasures that European institutions have put in place, it looks like that they've been sort of playing the role of, they have been fleshing out a carrot with a stick policy. So when it came the time to flesh out policies that would counter pandemic, they attach strings to the benefits that would come with those policies, and they required Hungarian and Polish legal systems to implement, to protect the rule of law, with the assumption that courts that would respect the rule of law would be more responsive to the need to secure a fair and effective allocation of funds. So it was, the logic was of this kind. I give you the money, you need to take care of spending the money in a good way, and part of a good way is having good courts, having independent, fair courts. Of course, there's logic in that, but the issue of the rule of law when it comes to courts in Europe goes much deeper. And this brings us to a third point I want to make. So if we look at how the European Union has worked so far, there has been an incredibly high level of compliance among domestic courts. And we all know that the preliminary ruling procedure requires and expects that domestic courts play a strategic role in that. So courts will be very, very open to refer cases to the European Court of Justice and to sing the tune that the European Court of Justice would like them to sing when the opinion of the European Court of Justice is issued. So to a large extent, what we have seen so far is a culture that has been living off a sort of obedience and compliance culture among European courts. And most of this culture is just surprising, because there's no mechanism that would be effectively able to enforce the European Court of Justice opinions and to interpret the to respect the European Court of Justice interpretation of EU law. And to a large extent, what we have is an overwhelming presence of EU law within the European Union without a European Union's administration at the local level and without European Union courts. They just rely on domestic courts when it comes to the risk. So when I said that the problem with the rule of law and the problem with the rule of law as enforced by courts is crucial for the survival of the European Union, I meant that without the insurance that, without ensuring that the rule of law is respected and the rule of law contemplates the respect of the European Union law and the Court of Justice of the European Union's role, the whole system of European Union mechanisms is jeopardized. So if domestic courts are captured, then what is threatened is not just the single state, it's a whole mechanism of compliance and harmonization among EU, within EU territories. This brings me to an additional point, which is a sort of self-reflection. Have we been prudent in fleshing out these voluntary compliance logic and dynamics when it comes to the mechanism to ensure the respect of the European Union law at the local level and the effectiveness of the European Union law at the local level? Well, the answer to me is no. It was great. It speaks volumes of the level of interest among Europeans to harmonize their own laws and to create a vibrant and cohesive environment, but it also speaks volumes of the presuppositions we have been living off of. And and about the threats that we are being confronting with. So it seems to me, and 15 minutes don't allow me to get into details, but it seems safe to me to say that this logic that's seen domestic courts complacent with this supranational edifice is a logic that is centered around cosmopolitan and non-positivist legal cultures. And a sort of skepticism towards nationhood, which we discovered is not that in line with some of the countries that actually resurrected after the overwhelming force of the Soviet Union dissipated. So whereas Western Europe was very much preoccupied on bracketing, on limiting states' powers, Eastern Europe was more concerned with resurrecting the role of the state. So that level of complacency within the European Union's West is not to be found, or less frequent at least, within the Eastern world, the eastern part of the European Union, and for several historical reasons, deeply rooted reasons. We also have underestimated the role of courts in bringing about the European Union's edifice. So courts have become key political players in fleshing out the European integration's path in a way that has attracted interest as well as skepticism and criticism. And this is quite common if you look at the second half of 20th century and especially last decades of 20th century. Strategic litigation has become one of the common means to push the political agenda by using courts, by triangulating your arguments, by using courts instead of parliaments. And this has happened also at the European Union level. So we have asked courts to do jobs that we should have probably asked political institutions to do. And one last point, we have probably overestimated the link between the rule of law and democracy. So when it comes to implementing democratic values, it's often the case that it's much easier to instill a sense of democratic values, to promote democratic values, to promote the importance of getting people to vote and to make them feel that their votes count, rather than other aspects of rule of law like fair trials and non-partisan tribunals. That is a logic that does not fully overlap with the democratic rule. Of course, there's a combination, they are tightly connected, but no, they're not the same. And it seems to me that it's being easier to push on to accelerate on the democratic front, but we haven't been able to accelerate on the judicial independence, just to make an example. Coming to the final point, is there any way out? Yes, I think there are several ways out, or at least there are several measures that can be taken to de-emphasize what we have been calling populist agendas and re-establish a sound relationship between the role of courts and the role of political institutions. One would be reconsider that courts have limits. We cannot expect courts to do all the job. These should probably take some pressure off of them. Second, the place of politics. Politics is an environment which we desperately need. Third, statehood is not a bad thing. And it's not perceived to be a bad thing, especially in Eastern Europe. And we must consider that. We should also probably reconsider the limits of rights thoughts. Of course, I'm referring to Marian Glendon's book of several decades ago. There are limitations in what rights can do, and there are also limitations in what rights-based narratives can do. And we should acknowledge that. And last but not least, and I think I'll defer to this, to my written paper, we should also rethink of the connection between the rule of law and international law. One of the most unexplored aspects is whether the rule of law commands the respect of international law. This has been shortcut by a sound legal culture that has seen domestic judges interpret national laws and giving priority to supranational law. But one of the aspects that have not been explored yet is whether the rule of law itself requires that we do respect international law. And this, of course, could bring about a new relationship between what is within the state and what lies outside the state. Because one of the frameworks, of intellectual frameworks that have been exploited in the East is exactly that European Union is just an international law animal, nothing more than that. And so if we reconsider the role of the rule of law vis-a-vis international law, we might experience some enhancement in how we conceptualize the relation between the two. Lina, I'll stop here. I hope some of what I said makes sense and it's going to be useful for you. And of course, I look forward to receiving comments and criticism.
Dear Andrea, thank you very much. That was really a very interesting way of thinking, and you put a lot of issues on the table, I would say. Of course, we would have needed much more time for you to develop all these thoughts and issues. I don't want to precipitate the paper of Giuseppe Martinico because I would rather give him the floor. Just allow me to say that Mr. Martinico is a full professor, again, of comparative public law, like Professor Pin, but in Italy again, but now in another very beautiful city of northern Italy, in Pisa, the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. Previously, he worked at the same university, and before that, he was García Pelayo Fellow at the Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales in Madrid, and Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. So I'm sure his thoughts are going actually to develop a little bit more the whole issue about populism. So, dear Giuseppe, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, I said thanks indeed, Lina, for this kind invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be with you, although virtually. Recently, as Lina said, I've been working on how populists in power use categories and concept of the constitutional theory and instruments of constitutional law. In my latest monograph, I also argued that the populist approach to constitutional concept can be described in the light of two strategies: mimetism and parasitism. Parasitism is not a new concept in the field of studies on populism. Nadia Urbinati, Benjamin Arditi, and more recently Theo Fournier used this analogy to describe how populism can affect the equilibria of constitutional democracy. Mimetism here describes how populist leaders endeavor to present themselves as consistent and compatible with the language of constitutionalism. In other words, how they hide behind the words of the Constitution in order to legitimize their claims. In this paper, I'm then going to apply this conceptual framework to the abuse of the identity argument made by populists. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to divide it into two parts. In the first moment, I shall recall the theoretical apparatus, to say, while in the second part, I shall focus on Article 4.2. So an example of the mimetic approach used by populists is a speech given by the at that time Italian Premier Giuseppe Conte at the United Nations in 2018 during his first government based on the coalition between Lega and Cinque Stelle. On that occasion, he said, I'm quoting him, when some accuse us of sovereignism or populism, I always enjoy pointing out that Article 1 of the Italian Constitution cites sovereignty and the people, and it is precisely through that provision that I interpret the concept of sovereignty and the exercise of sovereignty by the people. Now, here one can see the attempts made by populists to find a reading consistent with the text of the Italian Constitution by stretching at the same time some of its key concepts, and most importantly, exercising a sort of cherry-picking approach to the Constitution. Indeed, when referring to Article 1 of the Italian Constitution, populists tend to mention only a part of the relevant provision, the part recognizing the principle of popular sovereignty, in order to find the confirmation of their majoritarian approach to the fundamental charter, and in order to reinforce the false dichotomy between themselves, the people voted by the people, and the others, the enemies of the people. They don't refer to the question of constitutional limits. They don't refer to the chains of constitutionalism, so to say. Now, indeed, a populist tactically omit that the same Article 1 of the Italian Constitution clarifies that popular sovereignty should be understood as limited by the Constitution itself, as the provision reads, sovereignty belongs to the people and is exercised by the people in the forms and within the limits of the Constitution. This approach is very telling of how populisms try to legitimize themselves as political forces consistent with the Constitution, but at the same time, when looking for such a literal link with the text of the Fundamental Charter, they also advance an alternative reading, what I call my book, a constitutional counter-narrative of two of the constitutional concepts mentioned in that provision by relying on their constitutive ambiguity. And another example of mimetism and parasitism in action is given by a famous speech offered by Viktor Orban, in which democracy was emptied of its liberal component. This brings us back to parasitism indeed, which refers to how populists alter, change the equilibria in the constellation of values characterizing the constitutional democracy. In so doing, they present democracy and understood as the rule of majority as a kind of trump card which should prevail over other constitutional values. Now, one of the greatest difficulties encountered at the beginning of this kind of research was how to deal with the mass literature on the concept of populism. Populism is, as Yves Meny and Yves Turel pointed out many years ago, characterized by constitutive ambiguity. Now, instead of trying to define a priori populism, I decided to proceed by identifying some elements, some ingredients, if you want, that are of particular interest to constitutional law scholars. And these are extreme majoritarianism, identity politics, as we will see in the second part of my speech, and politics of immediacy. Populists understand constitutions as straitjackets, and this point is shared somehow, by some supporters of popular constitutionalism as well, and as obstacles to the fulfillment of the will of the people, the real democracy in their view. In so doing, they create another false dichotomy. They are very good at creating false dichotomies, that between democracy and constitutionalism. Now, how do populists attack the Constitution in this context? They do so by rehabilitating the concept of constituent power, as stressed by Arato in his works. Constituent power in their narrative, in their constitutional counter-narrative, becomes a vehicle of legal resentment and an instrument to question constitutional supremacy. Here you can see how instrumental the use of these categories is. They literally steal our words and concepts. The second element is politics, is identity politics. Identity politics, as Urbinati and Docio Especo explained, identity politics is crucial. Indeed, they argue that the transformative function carried out by populism consists in the strategy according to which populism would claim to determine the purposefully constitutionally inclusive notion of the people by depicting the people as a unitary and exclusionary concept. The third ingredient is politics of immediacy, a formula coined by Luigi Corrias in a seminar article published in the European Constitutional Law Review in 2016. This concept refers to a kind of politics which rejects the idea of mediation offered by a representative institution. This again confirms that populism aims to construct a constitutional counter-narrative by using constitutional theory concept, and reveals the anti-pluralist understanding of democracy endorsed by populist movements. Politics of immediacy also leads us back to the fascinating debates about the noble and risky nature of referendums and their compatibility with representative democracy. Now, having clarified what I mean by mimetism, parasitism, and populism, we can move to the second part of the presentation, focusing on Article 4.2. So far, we have seen how populists use the mimetic approach with reference to the provisions of national constitutions, but the same pattern also applies to the provisions of the European treaties defined by the Court of Justice as a basic constitutional charter of the EU, Lever, Cadi, and many other decisions. As is well known, the literature on this clause is huge, it's enormous. For some authors, Bogdan and Schill, this norm will be an exception to the principle of primacy. For others, Monica Kleis, Barbara Guastaferro, it will be primarily a rule on competence that cannot be used as a trump card. Rather than being an autonomous ground for derogation, Article 40.2 will be a clause that can help interpret existing ground for derogation. See, for instance, what the Court of Justice did in Wittgenstein with regard to the concept of public order. Some colleagues have also accused Article 4.2 of offering arguments to autocrats, but I don't share this view. It depends on what we mean by identity, of course. And now I wanna focus on a very important case decided by the Hungarian Constitutional Court in 2016. There is then another more recent judgment given by the same court in 2021, but I'm going to focus on the language used by the Hungarian Constitutional Court in 2016, as it is a perfect example, in my view, of how mimetism and parasitism have been deployed, in this case by courts, to justify a claim which is against the very essence of the EU treaties. Here, the Hungarian Constitutional Court basically uses Article 4.2 to justify the departure from the content of Article 2 and the content of Article 6 of the Treaty of the European Union. How? First of all, it recalls Article 4.2, the duty to respect national identities in the plural. Secondly, it understood national identity as a constitutional identity and coupled it with the need to preserve sovereignty, a term which is not used in Article 40.2. Third, it read the concept of constitutional identity in light of a provision belonging to the Hungarian constitutional text, thus offering an alternative reading of the same formula. In so doing, the Hungarian Constitutional Court completely omitted or disregarded the fact that in Article 4 of the Treaty of the European Union, national identity must be read in system with the concept of a sincere cooperation stemming from its paragraph 3. In other words, the alternative reading of the constitutional identity offered by the Hungarian Constitutional Court is in evidence, is in pattern conflict with the meaning of Article 4 of the Treaty of the European Union and with other crucial norms, for instance, Article 2, the values, and Article 6, the principles protecting the fundamental rights. This example shows how instrumental and cherry-picking, once again, the populist understanding of the relevant EU law norm is. In this way, we have an alteration of the relationship between two principles that constitutionalized by the EU treaties, loyal cooperation and national identity, understood here as sovereignty. Then it would be also interesting to look at the language deployed in the decision of the same court in 2021, in which the Hungarian Constitutional Court tried at a certain point to distinguish between sovereignty and constitutional identity, but this could be stuff for the discussion if you're interested in that. This reading is obviously unacceptable. It is based on a mimetic interpretation and produces parasitism. This decision also paved the way for a constitutional reform. Now, Article R.4 of the Hungarian constitutional text reads that the protection of the constitutional identity and Christian culture of Hungary should be an obligation of every organ of the state. Here we can see how populists understand identity as a sameness, according to the distinction between sameness and selfhood regained by Michel Rosenfeld in his book on the identity of the constitutional subject. In other words, they understand identity in a static manner, as a sort of wall. Now, should we renounce national identity in light of decisions like this? I don't think so. I think that national identity is not a bad thing per se. How can we debunk this the constitutional narrative, this constitutional counter narrative then? Elsewhere in a paper published in the European Public Law, I developed some proposals to overcome this instrumental use of Article 40.2. My first recommendation regards the need for a systemic interpretation of the clause. In other words, this clause should not be read in isolation, but in context, since it is a star in a broader constellation of values guaranteed by the EU treaties. My second point directly stems from the first, Article 40.2 should not be detached from the reference to the moment of commonality, common principles and values recalled in Article 6 and in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. This was clear in the wording of Article 6 pre-Lisbon formula. This is the old version of Article 6 before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, in which both national identity and common constitutional traditions were governed by the same norm. It is likely that the decoupling that occurred in the Lisbon Treaty was a mistake, galvanizing the temptations of a unilateral and decontextualized reading of the identity clause. So, a systematic interpretation is needed, but one could wonder what the system is in a multi-level context like that characterizing European constitutional law. Although the Court of Justice is the interpreter of Article 40.2, we should refrain from the temptation of making national identity a purely European concept, in my view. In this respect, I think that national constitutional courts have the right to advance a proper interpretation of what national identity is in their legal system within the preliminary ruling mechanism, triggering in this way an exchange of arguments with the Court of Justice. The Luxembourg Court wouldn't be bound by the interpretation given by the national constitutional courts, but should respectfully take it into account by giving reason. Here we have a sort of procedural duty, if you want, by giving reasons in case of an outcome which does not take their view on board. This is the only way of avoiding a contra litteram interpretation of Article 40.2, in my view. Against this background, and this is my last point, the use of the preliminary ruling mechanism is key in order to distinguish loyal and bad courts, good and bad conflicts, as I wrote more than 10 years ago in the first edition of this book. In this sense, once again, what the Hungarian Constitutional Court did in 2016 does not have anything to do with the proper use of Article 40.2, as the Hungarian judges didn't activate Article 267 on that occasion. Thank you very much. I look forward to receiving your comments.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. These were really some very original thoughts that you have made and written in your books concerning the phenomenon of populism and its relationship to constitutionalism. Obviously, the literature is huge. Sometimes you can hardly actually follow all that has been written on the issue. But it's really a very interesting phenomenon, and I think we are still within it. Maybe this is the difficulty also, how to evaluate some social phenomena and political phenomena in the wider sense of the word that are actually still in action. So I'm very happy to welcome interventions, questions, or whatever you feel like. And Martin has already, yes, Professor Martin Belov from the University of Sofia. Please, Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lina, and I would like to thank Giuseppe and Andrea for their interesting presentations. I really miss not seeing them in person after these years of confinement. Also, we met with Andrea in also a very sunny place recently. I just wanted, I'm not going to talk a lot, I just want to mention that I feel like a child of parents who are divorcing. And two parents that are divorcing are unfortunately liberalism and democracy, right? Something which has been widely explored, for example, by Paul Blocker and others. So we are witnessing a huge trend of, widening the gap between inclusive forms of participation based on ideas of popular sovereignty and public engagement and technocracy. This is quite remarkable when you go to mainstream liberal countries. I hope they are still like that, like France, for example, or Germany. Then you have that form of criticism towards populism, and then when you talk with some Hungarian colleagues, especially involved in politics, then they make that distinction. I'm sorry. They make that distinction. We, the democracies, and they, the rule of law countries. So I believe one of the issues. How to cope with that increasing mismatch, although it's also to an extent objective, produced by the rise of new technologies and new forms of government, which go beyond our traditional instrumentarium for coping with governance and conflict. But one of the issues is that actually there was no clear political will how to proceed further, right? So we are in a political stalemate, which is kind of obvious. And that's why we let the courts dribbling at the center, taking political decisions since the politicians cannot either impose or negotiate a path forward. So I'm really afraid that in most of the multi-level systems, with the obvious cases are USA or Germany or Switzerland. So the real federations, not the one which were artificially made after some supreme decision. The political issues have always been solved politically, and sometimes even through the use of imposition, to put it in mild terms, of the will. So we'll see. I think my relatively negative prediction and fear is that we will see in the near future, also in the midterm future, this increasing mismatch between technocracy and populism, leading to either elitism and technocracy and oligarchy, or to radical forms of misuse of popular sovereignty. And at a certain point, this is for sure a political issue, and it will be solved politically. But we'll see how. So that's what I wanted just to share as my opinion.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Bellof. Yes, I also, maybe the system will at some stage find an equilibrium between these two poles that you have just described and both speakers have talked about. Let's hope that this will be the future and not having the discrepancies, or how, as you have very correctly put it, the divorce between our two parents, which are the parents actually of the liberal democracy, because I can't think of liberal democracy without liberalism or without democracy, because it wouldn't be strong enough to survive, I would say.
I would say dream for the better and prepare for the worse. But I don't want to introduce further pessimism in the discussion.
Yes, Martin. Okay. Anybody else, could you please take the floor and pose some questions to the speakers, or say your own opinion, how you feel like the phenomena that have been described? Yeah, Mr. Francesco Casagrande. Hi, Francesco. Thank you very much for being with us. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Papapoulou. Well, I have two questions. The first one is about the topic introduced by Professor Andrea Pin, about the rule of law. I remember several political scientists, among those Adnan, but also Morlino, distinguishing between the so-called procedural aspect of the rule of law and the so-called core aspect or hard aspect of rule of law. And generally in the literature, we find out concerns mainly about the procedural aspect of rule of law, how those can be manipulated, or how these procedural aspects can end up harming the rule of law. But according to what I could understand from your presentation, it looks like that some of the main issues of the rule of law in the European Union are related to the hard aspect, to the core aspect of rule of law. And I was wondering what the solution and what the possible way to combine those the aspects to make them coexist. I mean, how can we make sure that we have both procedures which do not harm the procedural values of rule of law, and keep forms of hard values of the rule of law which are compatible with European constitutionalism?
Yes, thank you very much for these thoughts, Francesco, that you shared with us. I'm sure the speakers will then have something to reply to these thoughts. Anybody else who would like to intervene? Any questions or thoughts? There are a lot of young scientists with us. Okay, let me pass the floor now again to the speakers to maybe to make some comments to the comments that we have just heard. And then if somebody else then has a question or a comment, you can still come back. Okay, Andrea, please.
Okay, thank you for the comments. I'll try. So as to Martin's remark on the fact that to a large extent the Court of Justice just did the job that politicians could do, right? I think it's part of the picture that you paint. I agree with you. But I do believe that there's a lack of analysis, at least on my side. So I'm not gonna speak about other people on the limits of jurisdiction. So you can get to a point at which you can say, this is bad, but I cannot do anything about it. And I can't recall of any instance in which a court said, I can do that, I cannot do that. So the idea that the judicial spectrum and the political spectrum intersect each other is very much within the framework of the European Union's edifice. And sometimes it's just natural for judges to put some burdens on their shoulders, whereas I'm making the case that sometimes they could just say, I can't do that, we can't do that. Just I think that's I think I relate with your comments, but I do believe that there's a lack of self-awareness, which is widespread within the European constitutional culture. Coming to Francesco's comment and question, actually. So I do see, I think I do see your point that there are two competing readings of the rule of law. One is more formalistic, the other one is more substantive or substantial. I would not overestimate the divide between the two, the gap between the two, because both believe in courts as places where you can find a remedy. So both believe that. And what is happening actually is that the European Union's culture has probably emphasized the substantive component, but what we call populist regimes have been doing is jeopardizing also the formalist component. So when you deprive courts of their fairness and their non-partisanship, you're not just threatening the culture of rights, you're also threatening some of the most essential and undisputed components of the rule of law. So just to give you an example, when Orban says, we are pursuing a liberal democracy, he is clearly fleshing out the idea that some of the rights that were created or developed by courts don't go along with his view of Europe and Hungary. And of course, this is a matter of controversy. And to some extent, because of what I said before, I can see his point. What I cannot follow is threatening courts' non-partisanship to make his case. So it seems to me that even though I see the gap between the two, I think that both of them are jeopardized. I don't know whether this responds to your question, but that's my reading at least.
Okay, thank you. Giuseppe, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, thanks indeed. Thanks to my friend Martin for his comments. There is a lot of stuff here because well, I think that populism is the shadow of democracy, as Kahneman once powerfully wrote it. So this means that Paul Blocher is right when he argues that probably we should study this new wave of populism as a manifestation of a broader crisis of democracy. I do agree. I also think that there are possible remedies in the sense that we should try to overcome the defensive approach that sometimes the constitutional lawyers have when dealing with the populism. So trying to identify and trying to filter, I mean, some of the proposals made by populists, because it may happen that among these proposals, I mean, there is something that could give an added value to the to the institutions of representative democracy. I give you an example of this effort that I think we should make. I mean, the internet is a political resource, as for instance, the 5-Star Movement or Podemos have argued, but safeguards are necessary. So the populist option of overriding the role of parliaments is not compatible with the essence of constitutionalism, as it would produce a very dangerous kind of instantaneous democracy, as Ming-Sun Kuo called it. At the same time, techno-populists have a point when they insist on the potential of the internet for the democracy of tomorrow, as new technologies offer interesting ideas for redefining the relationship between democracy and constitutionalism. I give you an example. In Italy, during the pandemic, the parliament has been really marginal because, among other things, its members cannot vote remotely. I think that this is incredible with today's technologies. And another example is the referendum. The referendum is a very noble but primitive instrument of the democracy, but it can be tamed in a way. We can find ideas in comparative law to make it less binary, less primitive. Look at what happened in New Zealand with the referendum about the flag. With a multi-stage referendums. Look at what happened in New Caledonia with the repeated referendums in order to avoid, to rely too much on the stomach of the voters, right? So I think that we can find solutions to try to filter some of the claims advanced by populists without jeopardizing the untouchable core of post-totalitarian anti-constitutionalism. And in this sense, the constitutional law is very important because it can contribute to giving a sort of message of hope. And I think it's necessary to overcome the current crisis. So thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I think these thoughts are very important because they tend to lead us to the direction that I had wished or implied, actually, to find some solutions to bring again very close liberalism and democracy, the procedural guarantees and the substantive guarantees of the rule of law, and the procedural guarantees which have to do with the participation of the people, a more active participation, so that the populists cannot claim for themselves democracy as such, because this is indeed very, very bad, if you ask me. Because democracy without liberalism, democracy without personal freedom, without equal freedoms for everybody, it's not democracy. What can democracy mean, for example, when you don't have the right to develop freely your own personality, when you don't have, let's say, sex or gender equality, you don't have care for vulnerable groups within the society, then this will not be a democracy after all. It will be, let's say, a democratic facade for an oligarchy after all. So I'm very skeptical about what about the whole discussion that a separation, a divorce between liberalism and democracy is possible. According to my opinion, it is not possible, not for a longer time. It can only be for a short time, but after a while, everything will be jeopardized, both liberalism, if you don't have democracy, let's say in an enlightenment oligarchy or monarchy on the one hand, or illiberal democracy on the other. These are not regimes that can actually live for a long time, according to my opinion. Are there any other fellows that you would like to intervene, to participate to our discussion by expressing their views? Okay, if not, we can close the session. Before closing, I will just again ask the speakers if they want to add something, although they have already spoken. Andrea or Giuseppe, would you like to add something?
No, I actually have a question. If you could, so
Yes, of course.
first of all, I'll need to apologize with my distinguished colleagues for not being able to attend the sessions, and I look forward to read the papers. Of course, if in due course you'll be able to, Lena, to inform us about how to proceed, move further. Of course, you have already dropped some important information, but if you could just,
I would definitely will.
thank you.
And as you have consented, we are going to upload this session on YouTube. So also the other sessions, most of colleagues have consented to it. So you will be able also to see it on our YouTube channel, the YouTube channel by the Jean Monnet Chair for European Constitutional Law and Culture of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. So if there's nothing else to be added, I would like to thank you all. Yes, please, Giuseppe, of course.
Dina,
yes, of course.
Just a very quick point. I mean, to clarify that I do agree with Andrea when he argued that courts cannot do all the job. I mean, I think that there is also interesting literature, for instance, I mean, some works about the importance of civil society written by Andrew Arato, who look at the Turkey and Hungary and stressing how their constitutional courts, I mean, were captured after having tried to resist the system alone. So I think that this is a very good point. I also agree with you when you say that there must be a liberal component for democracy. I think that all those who insist on illiberalism as a constitutional project tend to forget the lesson of others such as Kelsen and Bobbio. I mean, they have managed to I mean, show that liberalism is still crucial in the life of the democracy. Finally, I was forgetting to say this, that I do agree, I mean, with Paul Blocher, who was mentioned by my friend Martin, about the importance of analyzing this stuff in a sort of holistic manner. At the same time, I strongly disagree when he speaks of a thing called the populist constitutionalism. I think that here there is the risk to, I mean, lose in a way the normative dimension of constitutionalism, and to reduce the constitutional law to a mere codification of power relations. I think that the constitutional law is much more than this, but this is a footnote, I mean, to respond to my friend Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Martin, you'd like to react to that? Or?
Well, that can be a very long discussion because it was really one of the hot topics for the last 5, 6, 7 years. I just want to say, without opening a new discussion at the end of the almost closed first part, that we focus too much on Poland and Hungary, but we underestimate other countries and parts of Europe and the West which fly under the radar, right? Of course, you can imagine that I'm meaning Bulgaria, but also Romania, and also there are some not wonderful trends elsewhere. Even in France, that's obvious, but also in Greece, there have been some elements of controlling of media, right? So, but just if you compare the Polish, Hungarian, and Bulgarian case, I mean, that's quite obvious, you know, over underestimated. Like you have Orban, who was trying to propose a brand new model, so he was like brutally hitting the wall. Then you have the Polish guys who are in the strict sense populists, right? Because they're really trying to trace down the public opinion and be extremely, you know, responsive to the opinion of the day. And then you have countries like Bulgaria and elsewhere where you have populism on a day-to-day practice, but we are formally compliant. Right, so nobody cares about countries which are neither interesting nor dangerous, but and also formally compliant, right? So I have to tell you, to sum up, you know, to make the long story short, I have to tell you that we focus on Vesuvius but they are trembling elsewhere as well, and suddenly we may be surprised by a massive earthquake, underestimating other sources of disruption. So we have to see the whole picture and not only focus on specific issues, right?
Yes, thank you, Martin. I agree with that, but I don't think we focus only on those countries. I think everybody has their eyes on France, for example, and I mean, that would have been a big change if Le Pen would have won, for example. So I think we're all very much alert, but on the other hand, except from being alerted, so to say, we actually also need to imagine or a new constitutional imagination. For example, the solutions or the examples that Giuseppe actually proposed to find new ways for participation. I think this is to the right direction. So we should not be very strict in what we have already known until now, but we should use both technology and the constitutional imagination in order to bring both democratic processes and liberal guarantees forward, I suppose. Okay, is there the need for anybody else to say something?
If
Okay,
there's
yes.
no time, I would like to pose a question to Professor Martinico.
Yes, please, Francesco.
Well, generally, when we talk about populist parties, we see that those kind of parties are generally at opposite sides of the political spectrum, like either far right or far left. It's very difficult to find a populist party which is a centrist party. And I was wondering if, according to Professor Martinico, the components of extremism can be de-escalated with a so-called negative integration. So when a party ends up obtaining a certain kind of responsibility and end up facing certain kind of challenges, then there's an actual need of collaboration, of integration with other parties, with other ideas, and in the literature of political science, there are lots of examples about those kinds of aspects in various parts of the world and in Europe as well. So I was wondering what Professor Martinico thinks about this particular theory of the negative integration of extremist and the populist party after crisis.
Thank you, Francesco. Yes, please, Giuseppe, you have the floor.
Thanks indeed to Francesco. I think that we should regain the distinction made by some political scientists such as Casmiude or Marco Tarchi in Italy between, let's say, extreme or far-right parties and the populist parties, because otherwise we risk losing the importance that the concept of populism might have. I don't agree with those authors that deny the analytical validity of this concept. It might happen, however, as you correctly pointed out, that even some far-right parties could use some elements of the populist narrative. After all, there are also the political scientists who have studied populism as a political style, so it might happen. In this case, what should we do? Is a negative integration a solution? And I would say that, being a comparative lawyer, very much depends on the context. There are some legal systems in which you can rely on some extreme forms of negative integration, for instance, militant democracy. But even there, if you look at the recent case law of the German Constitutional Court, for instance, a decision given, I think, in 2017, if I'm not wrong, you will see that even there, the Constitutional Court of Germany tried to limit the application of military democracy, and by making it a real extrema ratio. Why? Because it thought that it is always better to try to integrate. I mean, those who claim to question the system, and then it introduced, I mean, this complicated distinction between anti-constitutional parties and unconstitutional parties, a distinction which led to the constitutional amendment then in Germany. I think that that was a wise decision. I mean, the constitutional democracy, in my view, should try to create integration and pluralism. Otherwise, it would deny its essence. It is also true that sometimes this is not enough. And so perhaps in those systems where militant democracy is an option, I think that the relevant actors should take it into account. But militant democracy is not so widespread, I mean, instrument. So this is the only case of negative integration that I have in mind. Then, of course, this is, I mean, you can create, I mean, a sort of a convention, the excludendum, no? I mean, to exclude on a regular basis populist movements, but I think that this would be very problematic because this would create, in my view, I mean, rage and distrust. While I think we should try to transform this mounting distrust into democratic virtue, try to improve constitutional democracy. And that said, there might be the case for some populist claims that can be filtered and channeled, I mean, using the constitutional procedure designed by the Fundamental Charter. Thanks, Edith, for your question, Francesco.
Thank you very much, both of you, Francesco and Giuseppe, for this very interesting dialogue. Okay. Andrea, any closing words, or do you want to add something?
Yes. So I'm not capable, of course, of making synthesis, but it seems to me that there's a common thread that unites my thoughts with Giuseppe's, at least, as well as some of many others, which is that what we call the populist challenge gets to the core of some of the fundamentals of European legal culture. And instead of repudiating the whole deal of challenges, we should face them and develop a more crafted idea of what legal integration is and what is expected from the states, from courts. So to some extent, we cannot simply shy away from pushing further with a more accurate interpretation of our own legal culture and how democracy relates to the legal institutions and to other constitutional values. So it seems to me that instead of fighting, as Giuseppe has been arguing for a while, instead of fighting populism, we should understand why populism has been so successful. Because there's something that gets to the core of how we have understood our institutions. And unless we respond to those challenges, we actually either frustrate sizable portions of European societies, or we're doomed to fail. I don't know whether this is correct interpretation, but I think that this is a common thread that cuts across of our speeches.
Yes, I think that is a good way to finish, maybe with some hope that we will be able to find this this new threat to unite both, let's say, ends, both poles that make up constitutional democracy. So again, thank you very much, everybody, that you have been with us, and those of you who are in Thessaloniki, see you in physical presence. Yes, Martin, today. The rest of you, we hope to meet in person soon. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.